In the freezing silence of Central Park, a homeless little girl offers her only cookie to a man she's never met, unaware he's a tech billionaire who vanished after losing everything. What happens next is a miracle no one could have predicted. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story, it's a deeply human journey about lost resilience and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances and the hidden strength of ordinary people, and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now let's begin. The wind was sharp that morning in Central Park, the kind of cold that didn't just sting your cheeks, it crept deep into your bones, quiet and unforgiving. The trees stood bare, skeletal, and the early sky was the color of old pewter. Few dared the chill that day, and even fewer lingered long. But in one quiet corner of the park, where the frost still clung to the edges of the benches and pigeons huddled near trash cans, a little girl stood clutching a small crumpled napkin. Her name was Lila, just 5 years old, with tangled auburn curls and a purple winter coat that had once been bright, but was now faded and too short at the sleeves. Her mittens didn't match. Her boots squeaked when she walked, but her eyes, wide brown and quietly hopeful, still searched the world like it owed her nothing and might still offer something. Beside her sat her mother Caroline, tall and thin, wrapped in layers that couldn't quite keep the cold out. She looked both present and far away, like someone holding herself together with sheer will. Her hair was unbrushed under her hat. She had a paper grocery bag at her feet, filled with everything they owned. That morning they had no destination. Their motel stay had run out and the shelter had no beds. All they could do was walk until the city woke up, then sit and pretend the world wasn't as hard as it had become. Lila opened the napkin, carefully revealing the only thing they had left to eat, one chocolate chip cookie. A little broken, a little stale, but still soft in the center. Caroline had bought it the night before with the last of her coins, hoping it would at least bring her daughter a smile. "Here," she said gently, pressing it into Lila's hands. "Breakfast, sweetheart." Lila looked up, her breath visible in the morning air. "Aren't you gonna have any?" Caroline forced a smile. "Already did, baby. You eat it." But Lila didn't eat it, not yet. She looked across the park, then suddenly stood up. "Lila," her mother said quickly, "stay close." Lila didn't answer. Her boots squeaked softly as she walked toward a nearby bench, toward the man sitting alone with his head bowed low. He looked like a shadow. His coat was dark, oversized, stained at the cuffs. His shoes were scuffed and water-damaged. He hadn't shaved in days, maybe weeks. From a distance he seemed asleep, but as Lila approached, his eyes slowly lifted. He was in his 40s, maybe younger, maybe older, it was hard to tell. There was something about his face that suggested he had once been handsome, but time or sorrow had worn it down. His name, though no one knew it, yet was Thomas Rowe. 6 months ago, Thomas was a name everyone in tech knew. He had been the genius behind Etherworks, a company that had promised to revolutionize sustainable energy storage. The media had called him a visionary. Investors hung on every word. Forbes had put him on the cover in February. And then, in April, everything vanished. His wife, Dana, had died after a rapid and brutal illness, pancreatic cancer, they said. Diagnosed in March. Gone in April, the kind of death that didn't give you time to fight, only time to watch. Thomas had watched helplessly, sitting in hospital rooms that smelled like bleach and despair, holding her hand while the light went out of her eyes. After that, he walked out of his own life, resigned from the company, withdrew from public view, let his penthouse gather dust. No one knew where he'd gone, and he had planned it that way. Until a little girl walked up to him in a frozen park and said, "You look hungry." Thomas blinked, startled. Her voice wasn't accusing, just honest. "I have a cookie," she added. "You can have it if you want." He stared at her, at the tiny mitten holding half a cookie, at the sweetness of the gesture, the absurd, incredible kindness. "I'm okay," he said softly, but his voice cracked. Lila tilted her head. "You don't look okay." Then, without waiting, she placed the cookie on the bench beside him and turned to go. Thomas reached out slowly and picked it up like it was something sacred. "You didn't have to," he said too late. Lila turned and smiled. "I wanted to." Back on their bench, Caroline watched with a mix of concern and awe. When Lila returned, she didn't say a word, just nestled back into her mother's coat, her small body radiating warmth in a world that had gone cold. Thomas sat motionless, the cookie in his hands, his eyes stinging. He hadn't cried in months. Not at the funeral, not when he'd signed the paperwork that erased his name from the company. But now, in the middle of an empty park, because of a cookie given without condition, he felt the grief hit him like a wave. He didn't eat it right away. He just held it like a lifeline. That cookie would remain with him for days, tucked into his coat, slowly hardening with the cold. But the warmth it sparked that stayed. And that night, for the first time in half a year, Thomas did something different. He wrote down her name. He didn't know how he'd learn it. He didn't even know if he'd ever see her again. But the girl in the purple coat with kindness bigger than her stomach had changed something. And that was how it began. With a cookie, a child, and a man who had forgotten what it meant to be seen. The cookie sat in Thomas Rowe's coat pocket for 3 days. He didn't eat it. He couldn't. Not yet. It felt like something more than food, fragile, symbolic, impossibly precious. He carried it as though it might fall apart if he breathed too hard. And every time his hand brushed against it, tucked between a crumpled city map and an unopened envelope he hadn't had the courage to read, he remembered the girl's eyes. Clear, honest, seeing right through him. He hadn't felt that seen in months. At night, in the corner cot of the shelter on 47th Street, Thomas would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what made a little girl like that offer what little she had to someone like him. He had spent most of his adult life in control of rooms of numbers of markets. But now he couldn't even control a tear when he looked at a half-eaten cookie wrapped in a napkin. In the quiet hours before dawn, memories would drift in uninvited. Donna's laugh low and musical, echoing off their kitchen walls in Palo Alto. The way she used to hum Sinatra when she cooked Sunday pasta stirring sauce barefoot in her favorite oversized hoodie. She had been sunlight in human form, brilliant, stubborn, warm. And cancer had taken all of it. Fast. He remembered the hospital room, the beeping, the smell of bleach and plastic, the sterile ceiling where he counted the same stain in the tile 100 times, willing himself not to cry. He remembered how she had squeezed his hand already too weak to lift her own head and whispered, "Promise me you won't disappear when I do." He had nodded, lied. He didn't mean to. But grief does strange things. And his grief, quiet and corrosive, made him vanish. He resigned, walked away from Etherworks, deleted his social media, gave the apartment keys to his assistant and told her to donate everything inside. Then he walked. City to city, train to train, hotel to shelter. Eventually, New York. He didn't want to be found, didn't want to exist. Until the girl. Until Lila. The morning after she gave him the cookie, Thomas returned to the park. Not to find her, he wasn't ready for that, just to sit, on the same bench, in the same cold. He placed the napkin on his knee, unwrapped the cookie slowly, and stared at it. He remembered Dana's voice again. "You still have things to give." He hadn't believed her. but maybe a child had. He finally took a bite. It crumbled softly between his teeth, slightly stale, overly sweet, but it warmed something inside of him. He chewed slowly like it was sacred. That night, he found a scrap of notebook paper and a pen missing its cap. He wrote for the first time in nearly a year. Not code, not strategy. Just one name, Lila. He didn't know her last name, didn't know where she lived, but he remembered her voice, the curve of her smile, and the shape of that moment. That moment when she saw him not as a ghost or a burden, but as someone who deserved a cookie. He returned to the park each morning after that. Sometimes he saw them, Lila and Caroline, always together, always tired, always pretending they were just out for a stroll like everyone else. Caroline had the look of someone who had weathered too many storms but still stood upright. She held herself with a quiet kind of dignity one Thomas recognized. He used to see it in Dana's eyes when she said, "I'm fine," even when she clearly wasn't. Thomas never approached them. Not yet. Instead, he started bringing small offerings. Nothing obvious. A carton of milk, a pack of dried fruit, sometimes a folded note that simply read, "You are not invisible." He didn't expect anything in return. One morning, he placed a scarf on the bench where they usually sat. It wasn't new, but it was warm. He watched from a distance as Caroline picked it up, inspected it, and hesitated. Then she wrapped it around Lila's neck. The small girl spun in a circle, arms wide, laughing. Her coat still didn't fit, but the scarf trailed behind her like a comet's tail. That laugh, it did something to Thomas. It reached in and tapped on the parts of him that had gone numb. For so long he'd thought healing meant returning to the life he once had. But now, sitting on a cold bench in borrowed clothes, watching a child twirl in second-hand wool, he began to wonder if healing meant starting from a place where love lived, even when nothing else did. He started walking more. Not with purpose exactly, but with intention. He wandered into bookstores and spent hours in the children's section reading picture books quietly to himself so he wouldn't forget what children liked. He visited the public library and used the free internet to research shelters' job listings and eventually bakeries that delivered cookies just like the one Lila had offered him. He saved up for a small box. On the side of the box, he wrote one word in careful handwriting, "Thanks." He left it where they'd sat last. He didn't expect them to take it. He just wanted them to know someone saw them. Someone cared. That night, Caroline and Lila didn't show up. The bench was empty. He waited an hour. 2. Then he saw it. A napkin resting on the bench with a note scribbled in blue crayon. "Cookie Man, thank you. We like the peanut butter ones the best. L." He laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised, the kind that breaks out before sadness remembers to catch it. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Thomas slept without nightmares. Because someone had thanked him. Because a little girl had remembered. Because something had changed. The city moved quickly, but Thomas had started moving slower. He rose earlier each day not because he had somewhere to be, but because he couldn't bear missing them. Caroline and Lila had become a part of his daily rhythm, not in the way routines dull, but in the way routines comfort. He never approached too closely. He didn't intrude. He simply existed a few feet away, reading a paperback or feeding birds from his pocket. Caroline noticed him, of course. How could she not? He was there most mornings, same coat, same gentle presence. At first, she assumed it was coincidence. Then she thought maybe he was keeping an eye on them. But the things he left, the scarf, the notes, the box of cookies, they weren't threatening. They were quiet offerings from someone who clearly had no more than they did. One afternoon, Caroline was crouched near a trash bin sorting bottles to return for change. Her back ached, her gloves were torn, and Lila was sitting on a nearby bench humming to herself, cradling a juice box someone had left beside her. Thomas watched from a bench across the walkway. He couldn't stand it anymore. He rose, walked carefully toward Lila, and placed a small carton of milk and a wrapped granola bar beside her. She looked up, recognizing him instantly. "You're the cookie man," she whispered. Thomas smiled awkward, guilty. "Did you bring peanut butter ones again?" He chuckled. "Not today." Lila picked up the milk and shook it like she was testing its weight. "You always leave things when we're not looking." "Not always," he said, glancing at Caroline still too far to hear them. Lila leaned in conspiratorially. "Mommy said not to talk to strangers." Thomas nodded. "She's smart. You should always listen to her. But I think you're okay," Lila added simply, and began sipping the milk without another word. Caroline returned a minute later, saw him standing there, and immediately straightened her posture. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you following us?" "No," Thomas said calmly. "I've just been around. I didn't mean to worry you." "You've been leaving food," she said flatly. He hesitated. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to cross a line." Caroline looked at her daughter quietly, drinking beside them, then back at the man who looked like he hadn't slept well in months. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because your daughter gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. She saw me. That cookie wasn't just food, it was grace." She said nothing for a long while. Then her shoulders dropped slightly. "Okay," she said softly. "But if you're going to keep showing up, maybe tell me your name." "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Rowe." "Caroline," she replied. "That's Lila." They didn't shake hands. There was no ceremony, just an exchange of names, a lowering of walls. And that was enough. Over the next days, Thomas returned regularly, but now he spoke helped when it was needed. He carried Lila's backpack once, shared hand warmers, brought paper and crayons when he noticed Lila had been drawing on the backs of receipts. One morning, Caroline found herself talking to him longer than she meant to. He asked about Lila's favorite books. Caroline mentioned that Lila loved anything about space stars, rockets, astronauts. Thomas smiled but said nothing. That night, he went to the library and read every picture book about planets he could find. The next weekend, he showed up with a borrowed library card and took Lila inside the massive, warm main branch. Her eyes widened as she stepped into a room filled with more books than she had ever seen. Thomas crouched beside her reading aloud from a picture book called Zoom, the Girl Who Touched the Moon. Caroline, watching through the window, didn't interrupt. "She doesn't usually sit that still," she said as they walked home later. Thomas shrugged. "Maybe she just likes the stars." Caroline gave him a sideways glance but said nothing. One day, he handed her a folded note with a phone number on it. "A friend of mine owns a diner on 9th, he said. "They need someone in the mornings. Told him you're dependable." Caroline stared at the note. "Why are you doing this?" He met her gaze. "Because you haven't given up, and that deserves something." She got the job. The pay was minimum wage, but the shifts were consistent. Enough for warm food. Enough to stop skipping meals. And on the days she had to work early, Thomas began walking Lila to school. At first, Caroline protested, but Lila insisted. "He's safe, Mommy. He reads me books about rocket ships." She began calling him Mr. Cookie, then Cookie Guy, then finally Uncle Cookie. The nickname stuck. Thomas never pushed. He never asked for more than he was given. But piece by piece he became part of their days. Sometimes he carried groceries. Sometimes he read aloud while Carolyn finished dishes. And slowly a fragile trust began to form. One morning, as he helped Lila into her coat, she looked up at him and asked, "Do you think sad people are just waiting for someone to share their snack with Thomas?" Blinked. maybe he said. I think you were sad before, she continued, but now you smile more. He didn't know what to say. He just zipped up her coat and handed her the lunchbox he'd packed. Caroline stood by the door watching the quiet exchange, her arms folded, but her expression softening. Thank you, she said later that evening, for showing up. Thomas looked at her and nodded. No one should have to do this alone. And in that small kitchen with the flickering light bulb and the scent of reheated soup, something unspoken began to root itself deep. They weren't quite family, but they were no longer strangers, and that in itself was a quiet miracle. The heater in the apartment worked just enough to make the air not bite, but not enough to call it warm. At night, the windows fogged from the breath of 3 people who were still learning how to belong to one another. Lila slept closest to the wall, wrapped in 2 blankets, and her new red puffer coat which she refused to take off even inside. Caroline usually stayed up later, folding clothes, counting tips from her diner shift, or simply staring out the window, her thoughts moving faster than time. Thomas would sit across the room reading, or silently sewing buttons back onto worn sleeves. Neither asked for company, but they rarely sat alone anymore. That evening had ended the way so many had before quiet, uneventful safe. But Caroline noticed the change in Thomas. His hands shook a little more when he poured tea. He had been more still than usual, and not in a peaceful way. More like he was holding something inside that might crack if he moved the wrong way. When the apartment had settled into silence, she stepped into the kitchen and found him leaning over the counter, eyes closed, shoulders tense. "Are you okay?" she asked. He turned slowly, something in his face not masked fast enough. She saw the wear in his eyes, the weight of something long held. "I never told you who I really am," he said quietly. Caroline blinked, unsure what to say. "My name is Thomas Rowe," he continued. "I used to run a company called Etherworks." She stared, the name sounding vaguely familiar. Then it clicked. She'd seen it on the news once or twice years ago. A promising energy company, big investors, a young CEO who had just disappeared. "You wait, that was you," she said, not hiding the shock. He nodded slowly. "It was. I had everything once. A company, a penthouse, money, all of it. And then Dana, my wife, got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 by the time we found it. There wasn't enough time to save her. She was gone before I had a chance to believe she was leaving." He paused, eyes glassy. "I thought maybe I could fix it with money, with doctors, with more time. I built a world where problems could be solved. And suddenly, I was in a world where nothing could be fixed. After she died, I left everything. I didn't want to be found. I didn't care if I was." Caroline didn't respond right away, she just listened. "And then your daughter gave me a cookie," he said, a faint tremble in his voice. "And for the first time in months, I felt like someone saw me. Like I wasn't invisible." She sat down across from him, hands folded tightly. "You never asked who I was," he added. "You never looked at me like I was a project or a headline. You let me be here, be useful, be quiet when I needed to be quiet." Caroline stared at the counter for a long moment, then spoke, her voice low. "Maybe we both needed someone who didn't ask questions." She looked up. "The man I loved left when he found out I was pregnant, said he wasn't ready to be a father. I tried to raise Lila on my own. Did okay for a while, but I lost my job last year. Then the apartment. Everything just started slipping. I've held it together with duct tape and faith ever since." Thomas swallowed his throat dry. "You did more than hold it together," he said. "You survived. You kept her safe. You made sure she smiled." Caroline smiled faintly, but her eyes were tired. "If you could build an empire," once she said, voice soft, Maybe you can help build something again, something that matters more." Thomas looked at her, really looked. This woman who had carried the weight of a world no one saw, who smiled through exhaustion, who trusted him enough to let him near her daughter, even with all her instincts screaming to protect. "I'm not here because I want to feel useful," he said. "I'm here because I want to stay. Not because I think you need me, but because I finally want to be part of something that's real. That means something." She didn't say anything. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand on his. They didn't talk much the rest of the night, but they didn't need to. The next day, Lila ran into the apartment waving a piece of paper in her hand. "Look what I drew," she shouted. It was a picture 3 stick figures under a sky full of stars. One wore glasses and held a tray of cookies. One had long hair and carried a broom, and one, tiny in the center, was smiling between them. At the top it read, "Me Mommy and Uncle Cookie." Thomas laughed, the sound echoing through the room like sunlight. He stuck the picture to the fridge with tape. That night he walked to the corner store and bought fresh milk, a bag of flour, and chocolate chips. He baked cookies with Lila, helping her shape the dough, showing her how to press each chip into place like a gem. Caroline stood nearby, her arms crossed, pretending not to smile. And when the first batch came out warm and golden, Thomas handed one to each of them. "To small miracles," he said. Caroline took a bite and nodded. "To the ones we carry, and the ones who carry us." The snow had melted into puddles at the edges of the sidewalks, and the city, once brittle and gray, now carried the scent of thawing earth and roasted chestnuts from street vendors returning after the long freeze. Spring hadn't fully bloomed yet, but there was something in the light, a kind of softness, a golden invitation that made even tired streets look hopeful again. Thomas stood in front of the small brownstone at the end of the block on Madison Avenue. It wasn't grand. In fact, it needed new paint, and the porch light flickered stubbornly when turned on. But it had something his penthouse had never had: warmth. The kind that lived in the scent of fresh cookies and crayon drawings taped to the fridge, and in laughter echoing off slightly uneven floorboards. He had moved them in a few weeks ago, quietly, carefully, with enough space for Caroline to have a room of her own, and Lila to have a bed that didn't fold out of the wall. The guest room had been his, though it never really felt like he was visiting. The first night they spent there, Caroline had placed her hand on his arm as he passed her in the hall, and simply said, "You belong here too." And he did. Not because of the roof or the soft couch or even the kitchen that now smelled constantly of cinnamon, but because he had chosen it. Chosen them. On that particular morning, Thomas was in the kitchen wearing a flour-dusted apron. Lila was at the table, scribbling in a new sketchbook he'd gotten her from the bookstore down the street. Caroline was humming under her breath as she arranged wild daisies into a mason jar. The windows were open just enough to let the sunlight spill in, painting golden rectangles across the floor. Lila looked up suddenly, eyes bright. "Uncle Cookie, I'm drawing our family." Thomas smiled and wiped his hands on a dish towel. "What's it look like?" She turned the paper around to reveal a picture of 3 smiling stick figures under a house with heart-shaped windows. The tallest one was holding a tray of cookies. The shortest wore purple boots. The one in the middle had her arms stretched around both of them. "I made our house have warm windows," she said proudly. Caroline walked over and crouched beside her, wrapping her arm around Lila's shoulder. "You did perfect, baby." Thomas leaned on the counter, watching them, a quiet ache of gratitude blooming in his chest. It had taken losing everything to realize what home really meant. It wasn't in what he'd built with investors, or the zeros on a bank statement. It was here in a rented kitchen with 2 people who saw him as more than what he'd been or what he'd lost. Later that day, as the sky softened into evening, Thomas found himself on the front steps sipping tea from a chipped mug. Caroline joined him, arms folded her shoulder, brushing his. "You ever miss it?" she asked. He knew what she meant. The money. The power, he said. Sometimes. But it never felt like this. Caroline turned toward the window, watching Lila inside now, dancing to music only she could hear. "I used to think having nothing meant you failed," she said. "But maybe it's what made room for this." Thomas nodded. "You gave me a second life. You and her. Without even knowing it." Caroline reached over and took his hand. "You gave us one, too." Inside, Lila spun until she got dizzy and collapsed in a heap of giggles. Thomas and Caroline stayed on the steps a while longer, quiet, content, watching the lights flicker on behind those warm windows, proof that love, when given freely, could rebuild more than just walls. It could rebuild people, too. And that was more than enough. Sometimes the smallest moments carry the greatest weight. A half-broken cookie, a child's innocent gesture, a stranger sitting alone on a park bench, and just like that, a life begins to change, quietly, slowly, and in ways no one could have predicted. Thomas Rowe was once a man who had everything by society's measure. A CEO, a visionary, a man whose name lit up headlines and whose innovations were changing the world. But all of that crumbled into silence the moment he lost the one person who made all his success mean something, his wife, Dana. Grief stripped him of purpose, of direction, of the will to keep moving forward. So he disappeared. Not in the physical sense, but in spirit. He stopped showing up in his own life. That winter morning in the park he was no one, a forgotten soul on a bench, until a little girl with a heart full of light offered him her only cookie. Lila didn't know who he was. She didn't need to. She saw someone who looked sad and did what came naturally to her. She gave. In that moment, her small act of kindness cracked open a wall that grief had spent months building around Thomas's heart. It wasn't the cookie itself. It was the warmth behind it. The reminder that kindness still existed, that maybe, just maybe, he still mattered. Lila's mother, Caroline, was also surviving a silent war, a single mom who had lost her job, her home, and almost her faith in better days. But through all of that, she kept moving forward. For Lila. She worked odd jobs, folded clothes, and borrowed corners of strangers' homes, and hid her worry behind lullabies. What she didn't expect was that a stranger would start showing up not to rescue her, but simply to stand beside her. Thomas didn't enter their lives with grand gestures or promises. He entered with granola bars and paper for coloring, with a steady presence and no expectations. Over time, his quiet consistency became something Caroline could rely on and something Lila adored. He became Uncle Cookie, a name born from a moment he barely remembered but would carry with pride. Eventually, the truth came out. Thomas revealed who he had once been, a man with money, with titles, with the kind of influence that most people chase their whole lives. But it no longer defined him. Caroline didn't treat him differently. She didn't need a CEO. She needed someone who saw her. Someone who understood what it meant to lose and still wake up and try again the next day. And that's exactly what Thomas did. He didn't rebuild a company. He rebuilt trust. He didn't reclaim a title. He reclaimed his sense of belonging. And he didn't change the world. He helped change the world for two people who had almost given up on believing anyone ever would. From quiet library trips to late-night talks in a cramped kitchen, the three of them found their way to something most people spend a lifetime searching for: family. Not by blood, not by obligation, but by choice. And that little cookie, it became more than a snack. It became the first thread in a tapestry of new beginnings. So, what's the lesson here? It's this: you never know what someone is carrying. The pain they hide, the silence they sit in, the battles they fight alone. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is show up consistently gently without agenda. Whether it's a cookie, a word of encouragement, a shared umbrella, or simply your presence. We live in a world where we're told to hustle, to climb, to win. But maybe the real triumph is in slowing down long enough to notice who's sitting on the bench beside us. Maybe success isn't always measured by what we build, but by who we build with. By how we love. By how we give. Thomas found his second chance in the laughter of a little girl and the strength of a mother who never stopped trying. And he earned that chance by choosing to stay, to care, to be seen. So, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the beauty of ordinary kindness and the resilience of the human heart, then consider this your invitation, not just to reflect, but to act, to reach out, to share a moment, a meal, a message. You never know what miracle might come from it. And if you'd like to hear more stories that remind us what really matters, that touch the soul, and speak to the quiet parts of our hearts, then we'd be honored to have you with us. Please subscribe to Emotional Stories, where every video is a gentle nudge toward compassion, connection, and courage. Your support helps us continue to bring meaningful, real, and heartwarming stories to life. And trust us, we've got more cookies to share. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness to change everything.